All right, we got a file to download today, universitycrime.data.xlsm. This is the same data that we worked with on Monday, except it's been aggregated. So essentially, we've read the data out of the workbooks and pulled it into a common file. This is, this doesn't have all the years. I think we have 1 year out there that is actually your database project, is to read the additional year and add it into this data. But you'll be pushing it into a database, not into an Excel worksheet. But today is about pivot tables. Just by show of hands, how many of you say, you know what, I'm pretty comfortable with pivot tables, just using pivot tables? Oh, so it's probably a little more than half. That's good. When I first started teaching this, maybe 1 out of 10 students would have said, yeah, I'm pretty familiar with pivot tables. It's good because pivot tables are one of the powerful analysis techniques that's built into Excel. And so today it's not so much about learning how to use pivot tables as it is seeing what it takes to automate pivot tables. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a pivot table just to kind of build one together. Then we're going to record ourselves building that same pivot table, and then we're going to go look at the data and see what we have to change. And pivot tables is one of the ones where when you record it, for it to be useful, you've got to go in and edit it and make changes because it creates names that will make conflicts if you just try to run it again. Okay, so pivot tables on insert. I remember the first time, must have been, first time I tried to use a pivot table, I think I read like in PC Magazine, something about pivot tables in Excel and how great they were. I didn't have any data to analyze. I just wanted to figure out what a pivot table was. And I got to, well, I'll tell you that story here in just a minute. Then in 2007, when they switched from the menu structure to this tab orientation, I went looking for the pivot table, which is kind of an advanced feature. And somehow in my mind, I had it that advanced features are kind of more to the right and basic features are over here to the left. It took like a half hour to find the pivot table button because it was right here. It's the very first one. I just never looked all the way over there. Okay, so I'm going to have my insert. I'm going to have my active cell somewhere here inside my data. And I'll choose Insert Pivot Table. And it knows you can't build a pivot table on one cell. That doesn't make any sense. And so it says, oh, you must mean the contiguous cells from here. And so it expands it automatically. That's nice. So it's figured out what that is. And we're going to put it onto a new worksheet. That's great. So the first time I built a pivot table, I kind of got to this point. And back in the day, it must have been the late 90s. Back in the day, this didn't come up automatically. So it was here. It's kind of dropped you off here. Here's your pivot table. I kind of scratched my head and I looked at it and I right-clicked it and tried to figure out what to do and nothing. It's like, well, I guess I'm not going to learn pivot tables today. And it was years before I ever learned pivot tables after that. So I'm going to bring my field list back up. Field list, we can see it. So the whole idea behind a pivot table is to say, I want to summarize data across 2 dimensions simultaneously, 2 or more dimensions simultaneously. So, it's one thing just to say, I want to see the average of a column or maybe the average of a column grouped by some variable, but I want to see the average of a column grouped by 2 different variables. Give me a grid, or even, kind of within that grid, give me more distinctions than just those 2 groups. So you always need something to summarize. And so as we look at our data over here, that's what we have here as the values. So this is really you've got to have something numeric in your data set. I mean, you could do counts other than that, but typically you want something numeric to be able to summarize. So that's going to be our value over here. So we'll come back to sheet 1 and I'm just going to say, I'm going to drag value down here to my values. Drag value down here to my, I thought I could drag there. Is it my mouse that's having problems? I'll click it and it'll go there. Yeah, I guess. It was my mouse or my operating system that's struggling with dragging. Anyway. So now it says, okay, great. We're just going to sum something up here. So someone tell me, what does that number mean? Now, I haven't given it any other dimensions to look at this data by, and I haven't even told it just guessed at sum. I could have put average. But what does that data mean? What does that number mean? It is the sum of this column. But could you put some, it's the sum of a column, but could you put some other meaning on it? And the answer is no, because it's really different kinds of numbers that are mixed in here. Because if you look right here, this first row, it says, here's Auburn University in Alabama, the Montgomery campus. Their enrollment is 5,000 students, and they had like, what kind of crime did they have? They had 8 cases of larceny reported that year, and nothing else. So you're summing that 8 larceny with the enrollment, and that number doesn't make any, I mean, there's nothing useful about that number. Now, if we had gotten rid of enrollment, then it would at least be, that would be like the total number of incidents of crime reported, even in different categories. But because enrollment's in there, you go, that's just, it doesn't mean anything. We've got to give it some dimensions. And so why don't we go ahead and take the, I guess to give it some dimensions, let's go put a column header on, and let's give that the label. Okay, so now that gives me some, now these numbers mean something. So what this tells me is that, tell me what that number means right there. It's always a kind of a tough thing when you get a new data set and you start to summarize it. It's tough to kind of look at these and know what they are, but what does that number mean? The total enrollment for all universities. Does that make sense? Because that's 30 million. You think we have 30 million students in universities? Nowhere near that. So what is it? It's not total enrollment. Go back and look at the crime data. Find out why it's not total enrollment. No, there's no total at the bottom. This is all raw data. I bet you can see you're all really bright people, and you're going to be hired to like analyze data and stuff before too long. Yes, we've got 4 years of data. So what I'm seeing is I'm seeing Auburn's enrollment for 2006, and if I scroll down, I'm going to see Auburn's enrollment for 2007. And so summing those up, there's huge overlap, probably around three quarters overlap in those two numbers in terms of the number of people. So first thing is always to say, I want to be sure that I'm understanding the data and what these numbers are actually summing to. Okay, so we'll want to do something with that. But before we do that, let's add another dimension over here. I would like to go ahead and bring the state in as a row header. As a row, yeah, I'm going to call it a row header. So now I still have those same numbers way down here at the bottom. All those enrollment numbers still sum up here. But now, in fact, enrollment is a little bit tough, but the rest of these numbers are kind of ready to consume. So what does that 92 mean there? That 92 right there, Alabama, someone give me the English label for what that word is. So 2006, 2007, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think it's probably 5 years, and it's not the past because this data, has been an example now for close to 10 years. So, but yeah, over that whole period of time, there's been 92 auto thefts reported at universities in Alabama. This enrollment is tough. It's the sum of enrollment over those years, but still not a very meaningful number. But the rest of these, I think we can probably look at. All right, so we can add additional dimensions. Let's go ahead and add a year up to the, why don't we make the year a report filter. So I'm going to drag year down to filters. And now I can filter this down just to a particular year. And now my enrollment looks a little bit better. So that says in 2006, total enrollment across all universities in Alabama, 72,000 students. At least in the reported data. There's some data missing here. As we looked last time, there's no BYU report for 2011. So exactly, there are always problems with the data, but according to this data, that's what we have here. Well, let's go ahead and add a couple more dimensions here. So let me take type and make that a column header, and I will put it above the label. So it'll be the first group, and then we'll have the label underneath it. So now I can get a crime total, and I only have one kind of information. So the type is either crime or information. So now I can see here in Alabama in 2006, 768 crimes known to law enforcement that happened on college campuses. And then let's go ahead and allow ourselves 2 levels to drill down into the row. Let me bring the campus on below state. Actually, I want to put the school and then the campus. So state, school, and campus. And it's a little more collapsed than I want. So I'm going to right click here and choose collapse. And I'm just right clicking on Alabama. And I'm going to say collapse, expand collapse, collapse entire field. Did I say collapse entire field? Expand collapse, collapse. Oh, let's try collapse state. I want to collapse everything. Expand collapse, collapse entire field. That's what I hit first. No, I didn't. I just must have hit something else first. So now that's pretty good. So now I can kind of drill in. I can open up Arizona, you know, and maybe I want, these are kind of their different campuses they're showing here separately as well. But I can probably collapse that one as well. Did that go to all my other ones as well? Yeah. So now it's, you know, kind of a nice little tool. I can say, let's go ahead and take a look and see what's happening in Utah here. So I've got Utah. Do we have different campuses anywhere here? Utah Valley doesn't. Utah State has campuses. They're not reporting that way. So I guess here in Utah, we don't really go for the whole campus thing. But kind of let you drill down. Texas, I know, has schools with campuses. So let's try Texas A&M. Texas State, Texas A&M University. It's got then these other campuses. We can kind of go snooping around the data. Go ahead.
So I see like there's a check mark on this right side of the field. How does that correlate with those boxes down? Like I just check, but it's not necessarily hearing them.
Okay, so the question is, what are all these check marks for over here? And the answer is, your intuition is right. As if it's checked here, it's included in the report. Type is showing it's right here. But yeah, it just lets you know, are you even using that one yet? Now, it's not enough just to have the check mark because you have to put it somewhere as well. And it might be that if you check one, it'll guess at where you want it, but you have to move it around. The nice thing is that you can kind of quickly look and say, is there anything that I'm not summarizing by? Oh, yeah, the question is it best practice to always have everything checked? And the answer is no, that's not necessarily the best practice. It just really depends on what you're trying to look at the data here. So sometimes, one of the things that's really common, you know, this data was built specifically to do this example of pivot tables. But a lot of times you're using kind of another data set that's got other fields in it that you don't really need to summarize. It's not really part of the analysis that you're doing. And yet it doesn't really make sense to say, well, let me just copy out just the columns that I need for this analysis and make a different table with it. So you would just say, hey, you know, kind of bring in that set of data, and then I'll summarize it by what I want to summarize it by. So it is really common to say I've got fields here that are not checked at all. And of course, you know, there's things you can do. You can change, instead of sum, we can change this, go to value field settings. We can change this to any of these summary functions. We can show the value instead of the raw number. We can show it as like a percentage of the grand total, percentage of the row, percentage of the column total. We can tell it a difference from some other, say, you know, or just kind of, we want to compare everything to Utah. So we could show everything as being, or compare everything to BYU. We could just say, you know, what's its percentage of BYU, and it would all just show those percents. There's lots of things that we can do here, kind of beyond what we're going to do, but I think this is a pretty good example, except I may go ahead and collapse my column labels here. So I'll right click somewhere here on crime, expand collapse, and I will collapse all, collapse the entire field. So now I kind of get this summary table here that looks like I've got the state, I've got the total crime, I've got the enrollment for a particular year, and then from there we can kind of drill in and see, you know, more details about it. So I would like to, you know, now that we've kind of been through that once, together, because we'll be working with the code that it generates, together we are going to record ourselves building this same one again. We ready to do it? And then we'll take a look at the code and we'll see what it takes to kind of make code generate these pivot tables. All right, so I think I'm going to go ahead and delete sheet 1. Permanently delete it, yes. And I will go to my developer tab, click on record macro, make pivot table. We'll need a shortcut key for that one, and we'll say OK. So we're just going to go through that same process. Hopefully, since you've seen it once, you'll be able to do it along with me. But let me know if I'm going too fast. I'm selecting somewhere here in the data, and I am going to insert pivot table. I'll accept the defaults that are here. And then I'll just start configuring it. I'm going to take my value as, drag it down to my values. I'm going to put the state as the row, and then the next level below state is the school, and then the campus goes below it. In the columns, I'll put first my type, and then below that, I'll put my label. Then I'll add the report year as a report filter. And I may go ahead and set that to a particular year, maybe 2006. I realize I'm going kind of fast. Are we okay? Anyone saying, just give me a second to get caught up? All right. And then let's go ahead and collapse from the lowest level up. So I'm going to, right here on Auburn University, I'm going to right-click that and choose Expand Collapse, Collapse Entire Field. Then I'll do the same thing for state. And then I'll do the same thing for crime. So I'll click on crime right here, expand, collapse, collapse entire field. And I think that's where I want to be. Unless I want to put a filter on. Let's go ahead and add a filter as well, because we can easily, you can kind of ignore that code. So let's say we're just really interested to start off with Utah. So I'll uncheck select all. I'll bring Utah, or maybe we're interested in Utah, and I don't even know if we have any Idaho schools here. Idaho and Hawaii are the ones that are missing. So why don't we do Utah and Wyoming and Colorado, kind of our little cluster over here. We'll say OK. So that shows us, maybe for some reason we've got some kind of Mountain West area thing that we're saying, that's really how we want to start this out. Right? When we get this new set of data imported, we want to generate this pivot table so that we can hand it off to whoever does the analysis, and this is where they'd like to start. They can change the filter, and they can drill in and whatever, but this is how we want to start. We'll go ahead and stop recording, and let's take a look at the code. Better open up my Project Explorer and open up module 1. So it's actually quite a bit uglier than it needs to be, but let's get familiar with what it takes. First thing that happens here is not too bad, right? We're selecting a sheet, we're adding a sheet, or we're selecting a cell, we're adding a sheet, and then we're doing this create, and this is ugly. So let's take a minute and figure out what's going on here. So we've got the active workbook, that's pretty good, workbook that we're currently in. In fact, let's go ahead and change this. Let's change this to this workbook. What's the difference between active workbook and this workbook? It's often referred to the same one, but not always. This is a guess. You're making a guess. Go ahead.
So my brother was showing me some code that created, but my workbook is active, and it's an active workbook, so it's inputting the code into.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the active workbook is whichever workbook happens to be active when the code's running. I could have dozens of workbooks open and be running code in, running this code right here. And if I say active workbook, it'll be affecting whatever workbook happens to be active at the moment. This workbook, this is not a shortcut. It's a shortcut way to get to a particular workbook. But this workbook is the workbook that has this code in it. Doesn't matter whatever workbook is active. We're talking about the workbook that has the code that's currently being executed. Active workbook gets recorded quite often. And as you pointed out with your brother's example, that you most often probably want this workbook instead of active workbook. Okay. Now, somebody look at that word right there. We've never talked about this in class before, but at this point, we're past the halfway mark of the semester. You're half, by the time you're done with this, wherever you go for the next 5 years at least, you will be the VBA expert out of all of your peers. And so you're halfway to being a VBA expert. So I'm thinking you could look at this and tell me something about what I have selected here. Tell me what you think that is. That word I have selected fits in several categories. See if you can come up with one. Say that is a or an, and then put a word on it. Oh, it's definitely referring to something that's stored in memory. Okay. Okay, so it's not a reference. Reasonable guess. Someone else, take a stab. Wasn't too painful. It is an object. It is definitely an object. How can you tell it's an object? There's a dot after it. So it's either got a method, I'm not sure if it's a method or a property, but it's got something after it. If there's got some word and it says dot after it, it's an object. Now, it's a specific kind of object. Okay, so it's part of a collection. So this workbook gets me to a particular object, a workbook object. And so what we know about this is that it is either a property or a method of a workbook. Okay, and now just kind of look at the name. This next part, so far the things that you've inferred, they're good. This next one you'd be kind of guessing at, but just kind of look at the word and say, not only is it an object, it's a specific kind of object called a, no, it's not a cache, well, it is a cache, but that's not the kind of object. It's a collection. You'll notice that it's plural, so most times when we see something that's plural, that should be the cue. This is a collection. It probably has a count method and probably ways to add items into it and to get items out of it. And in fact, there's a method here called create that will put a new object into this collection. Okay, so we're creating a pivot cache. Now, I wouldn't have any reason to think that you would know what a pivot cache is, but here's the idea. We build pivot tables not on raw data, we build them on pivot caches. How many of you have ever built a pivot table on some data that isn't even in the workbook? You built a table, you built a pivot table, but the data's not in the workbook. Where's the data? It's in a database somewhere, and you're making a connection to that database saying, I want this data. Well, first thing that happens, does it copy that data into your workbook so you can build a pivot table on it? Well, it doesn't make it onto a worksheet, but it brings it in, puts it into a thing called a pivot cache. So it's the thing that we build. So regardless of where the data is, could be sitting on a worksheet, could be in a flat, like a text file, it could be sitting in a database somewhere. Step one in building a pivot table, that data has to come into a pivot cache. A data pot, you could think of it as a data pot. We're not, we won't be smoking this data pot, but it's, yeah, it's a container. It's just holding that data. Okay, so we've got this collection of pivot caches, and we're saying we got to make a new pivot cache. Great. So now this parenthesis, it starts there, and it goes all the way to there. Right? So these are the arguments that we are passing to the create method of the pivot cache. We're making a new pivot cache. Now, after the end of that parenthesis, we see another dot. So what's going on here? We've seen something like this in a couple of occasions before, but I wouldn't necessarily expect you to remember. But anyone can you say anything about what that is? What must be happening? Because there's a dot right there. Yeah, in fact, you'd probably say it's a method pretty comfortably because you're saying we're create pivot table, we're creating something more like a method than a property. But that means that everything that comes before that dot must evaluate to an object. That's got to be an object. So this create statement is creating a pivot cache, and it's returning a reference to the pivot cache that it created. That's why we can call create pivot table. Create pivot table is a method of what kind of object, of what class of object? It's not of a chart. We're creating a pivot table, and you can tell it's a method because it's whatever comes here. So what kind of object do you think is being returned to this point during the execution? A pivot cache, yeah. So we have the pivot caches collection. We're calling the create method. It's going to make a pivot cache. It's going to return that pivot cache here. And so create pivot table is a method of a pivot cache object. Is this complicated code? Absolutely. So much is happening here on this one statement. We're then taking that create pivot table, or that pivot cache, we're calling the create pivot table method, and we're giving it all these arguments. We're telling it what the destination is going to be. Here's the cell that we want it to go in. We're telling it what to name the pivot table, and this is the reason that it's going to be a problem, is because it's going to, next time we run it, it's going to try to create it with the same name. So we'll have to modify the code here, and then it tells us the default version. I don't know how many different versions there are. Apparently there's at least 6. But what style of pivot table is it making? And my guess is you don't have a lot of control over that, but you could probably go to earlier versions, like if we go, what was the pivot table like in Excel 2007? Maybe that was version number 3 or something. So if you wanted to create that kind, you could go back to number 3. I don't even know what the differences between them are. Okay, so this is ugly, but we're gonna kind of clean it up. So you don't see it happening here, but you could probably guess that create pivot table is also going to create a new object. It's going to create a pivot table object. Now, how come there's no parentheses? We have parentheses around this create, but there's no parentheses around the arguments for this one. Yeah, we're not doing anything with the object that comes back. It's going to return an object, but we're not doing anything with it. What did we do with the pivot cache that got created here? Yeah, we used that object to call its create pivot table method. And so we did something with the object that came back. We got to have the parentheses. But this one we're not, so no parentheses needed. Not only are they not needed, they're not allowed. You put parentheses around it, this will fail. Okay. So 2 different objects we're working with. We got a pivot cache and we got a pivot table. I'd like to separate them out. So I'm going to come right up here at the top and let's just make a couple of variables. Dim PC as a pivot cache. Dim PT as a pivot table. All right, now I'm going to come. I don't really need to select this range. Sheets.add. I do want to add a sheet. I will get your question here in just a second. But let's also declare an S as a worksheet. So let's start off by saying set S equal to sheets.add. So now we've got that particular worksheet set aside. We'll need that in a minute. And then we'll come to this. But there's a question. I don't want to run too far without it. Was there a question here and here somewhere? No? No. Okay. So this workbook.pivotcaches.create, I'm going to come right up here to this dot, and I'm going to just move that down. I don't need that yet. And instead, I'm going to say set pivot cache equal to that. Wait a minute, why do we have the parentheses on here? What are we doing with the value that's coming back from this method, this create method? Are we doing anything with it? What are we doing with it? Well, we're going to create a pivot table later. We're not creating it yet. We moved the create pivot table off of this. My question is, should these parentheses still be here, or do we take them off? Because we're not going to say dot anything after this. This line is done. Okay, if we take them off, it says, hey, we're not doing anything with the value that comes back, but we are doing something. What are we doing? Yeah, we're catching it. We're catching that reference, and we're assigning it to this variable. So the parentheses stay on. So now I've got that object there. I'm now going to create the pivot table. Set PT equal to my pivot cache dot create pivot table. And when I leave this line, there's an error. Someone tell me what the error is. Yep. Right, we have to have the parentheses. Before it was creating the pivot table but not doing anything with the pivot table that got returned, but now we are. We're catching that pivot table in a variable. We're taking the reference and we're remembering that it's just a memory location. It's an address of a place in memory. We're just remembering that in this variable. So we need parentheses around the argument list. Okay, so now we've separated this code out a little bit and we're ready to work with it. So this is looking at crime data and it has this address hard coded. Any thoughts on how we should adjust that? I mean, the whole idea here is that we're going to get some new set of data. Maybe we'll get new years added on to the data here and we want to create the pivot table. So we definitely don't want to leave this hard coded. Is there a question or a comment? Oh, is there a way to get the current range? There is. What's it called? It's called the current region. Yeah. So, yeah, and you'll notice you might be a little bit hesitant here, but it says this is a string. But really often when you have a string that represents a range, you can actually just drop a reference to a range in there. And that's the case here. So let's just go ahead and do that. So I've got a sheet called crime data, and actually it's just the code name of it. I can see that it's named right here. The code name of it is just data. So I can use that to refer to it here, question mark data dot cells 1. Which cell is that? Yeah, it's A1. It's the very first cell in the workbook, A1. Dot current region dot address. And so, yeah, it'll tell us what the current region is from that particular location. Question mark, your question here?
When you use it like in a comma, is it just usually if you only have one center, you just take the column?
Well, the question is here on cells, we're used to seeing 2 arguments there, a row and a column. What does it do if you just give it 1? And the answer is it starts counting at the first cell in the range. Now this is the whole worksheet that we're talking about. But if we had another range, some range that said dot cells, it'd be looking at that range that it's identifying, and it would start with the first one, row 1, column 1, and that would be number 1. Number 2 is same row, next column over. And so, we could go, all the way to like, let me get the current region off of this. There's like 65,000. So if I put 66,000, cell number 66,000, that's going to be on row 2. So the address that comes up here should be, I don't know the column, but it's going to be row 2. QV5, it didn't say that right at all. 66, oh wait, no, it's 16,000. So 16, let's try 17,000. Is that right? Yeah. So there are 16,000 some odd columns. And so if I go to 17,000, we are on row number 2, column number WR. So it just counts all the way across till it ends, and it comes down to the next row, counts all the way across there, all the way across there, and so forth. So, oh, darn it, I had this. Number 1 dot current region. And so now, instead of having this string here, I'm just going to drop in that reference to the current region. Source, Excel database. I guess this means data sitting here in Excel. Source data should be there. Version 6, that should be fine. So that'll create that pivot cache. Now, actually, if you try to create a pivot cache on a range that already has a pivot cache created, Excel is smart enough not to create another pivot cache. It will just go, oh, you already got a pivot cache there. That's the whole point. Don't make another pivot cache if you've already got it built. And so you might say, wait a minute, shouldn't we be checking to see if we have a pivot cache and then using the one that's there? And Excel is smart enough to say, if you try to create a pivot cache on an existing one, it goes, don't create it, just return the reference to that pivot cache. So that's kind of nice. But if it's not there, it'll create it. Set pivot table. Okay, so now we're making the pivot table. Destination is, ooh. Are we putting this on sheet 2? No, we're putting on whatever sheet just got created. Fortunately, we captured a reference to that sheet, but row 3, column 1 looks pretty good to me. Row 3, column 1, that's A3, right? Column 1 is A, row 3, yeah, A3. So here, I'm just going to say S dot range A3. Now it tells us to give it a name. You know what? I bet if we don't give it a name, it'll make up some name. So I'm just going to get rid of this argument. Table name, I'm going to let it figure out the table name all by itself. I could probably get rid of the default version as well, but I'll leave that there. It's not going to cause a problem. Having that table name might cause a problem, so I'm going to get rid of that. You know what? I'm going to put a stop. Just going to see if we're good to here. I want to run this right up to here. Questions before we do this? Yes.
So when you're setting the pivot cache, you have a source data equal to data.cells 1. That means that if for whatever reason the source data is not start on cell A1.
So yeah, so the question is, what if our data doesn't start on cell A1? And come back here to crime data. What if, for whatever reason, we look like this? I'm going to say what, by the way, do you know the keystroke to select the current region? Anyone know that? Oh, you know, I think Control A does it now. I didn't used to. No, I don't think that does it because I don't think it should select that. Maybe it does. I think it's Control star. No, so that is part of the current region when it's there. Let me go ahead and go a little bit larger. Control star doesn't get it now. If I'm down here, it will get it. What I really mean to be is right here. Control star. Control A used to select the whole worksheet, but now if you're in some data, it'll first select the contiguous data, and then again, it'll bounce out to the whole worksheet. But Control star is the one that just says get the current region. Yep. Question is, what shortcut key am I hitting to just add a row? So, you don't know that, huh? If the row is selected, then you can Control plus and Control minus to add and delete rows. Oh, really? I didn't know that. So if you're on the cell, you say Shift spacebar and then Control plus. Nice. By the way, if you don't have the whole row, you do Control plus. It's still trying to insert, but it'll ask, what do you want to do? You're just inserting a cell. Do you want to push stuff down or do you want to push it over? Or you can say, no, I meant to do the whole column. All right, but I'm going to go ahead and go back. It was a fun little detour. Okay, another question from the same questioner. Oh, you're saying, listen, you want to find the table. Well, how do you want to find the table? Give me an algorithm that'll, yeah, we can do it. Because, you know, I don't know, is it the only table? If it's the only table on this worksheet, yeah, we can find it. You want to find it? Only table, you don't care. You don't know what row it's going to be in. You don't know what column it's going to be in, but you want just to get that table, the one table on this worksheet? Sure, let's do that. So there's a great kind of little used method called used cells, I think. So worksheet.usecells.address. You maybe use range. Use range sounds better. There we go. .address. And so that is the smallest rectangle that contains the data on the sheet. So if I am not starting in A1, it won't include that. So this says from A10 to G23,173, that's the smallest rectangle that has all of my data in it. So if I know that I've got a table on there, I can just say, instead of cells data cells A1, I could say data used range dot cells 1. That would be the first cell of the used range. And then from there, I'll take the current region. And so if I really knew it was just one table, I could say used range. That's it. That would get it. But I'm hesitant because as soon as someone, does this and then, puts something way out here, it's pulling that in as well. So let's give that a shot. Have we tried to run this yet? I don't think I've tried to run this yet. Any other questions before we run it? Maybe we should run it and see if it works, then take any other questions. So let's go ahead and give it a go. No error, that's good. And it looks like it created another sheet up here. That's good too. We've got, sheet 3 and a blank pivot table. If I select this, it looks like it's built on my data. I've got the things right here. So far, so good. So so it's a good question. What if it's not an A1? And the answer is, if you can come up with some algorithm to say, I could find it if I could just do this, this, and this, that's where the data is going to be. You could usually a way to make that happen. Okay, so now we're doing sheets, sheet 2.select. Definitely not sheet 2 anymore. I don't even think we need to select the sheet for any of this, but it might as well. Oh, actually, we don't need to because why? When we add that sheet, where's that sheet going to be? It's going to be the active sheet already. So we don't need this. If we don't, why did it record that? Somebody wrote the macro recorder. Somebody wrote, say, what do we want to record when we create a pivot table? And they said, well, we should probably record that you select that sheet, but totally unnecessary because it's already created. We definitely don't need to select a particular cell. Okay, so now let's take a look at this. Whew. Active sheet dot pivot tables, pivot table 2. First of all, is that going to be right? Active sheet's going to get us to the right sheet. Pivot table is going to be the pivot table collection. Let's go back, and I think, it looks like it's named right here, pivot table 3. So yeah, that's no good. So what do we do instead? What do we put here instead? Kind of scroll up to the relevant part. Say, I heard it. Say it louder. PT. Yeah. Right. That's the whole reason that we captured a reference to that pivot table is so later in our code we could say we're doing something with that pivot table. So with PT. Now remember this with construct we don't use very much because I don't really care for it, but it gets recorded. So this just says, hey, from the with until the end with down here, if I have an expression that starts with a dot, just pretend that the PT is in front of it. So it looks like I set up all kinds of crazy things here. Grand column true has auto format is true. Error string. Are any of these things that I set? Did you all get this recorded? Because I don't think this is necessary. I think the macro recorder is just throwing this in here because these all look like defaults. At this point I didn't make any changes. Here's the first change I made. Pivot cache. No, this is still defaults that it's putting in here. What's your fancy? Should we delete this? Get it out of here? Same thing here. I didn't do some setting to the pivot table to make this happen. It's just recording the default. Now, am I glad the macro recorder does that? Yeah, because it kind of lets me know what the options are here. And I can say, oh, for this option, I want to change this one. Like refresh on file open. Maybe I do want that. And this is kind of nice. I could just change it here. But I'm happy with the defaults. So I'm just going to delete all of that. All right, so here's the next statement. Active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 2. What do I replace that with? PT. Dot repeat all labels, XL repeat labels. I don't think I said that either. We can get rid of this one too. But it's short enough, I'm going to leave that one in place. This is a candidate for deletion. Or since we're talking about the French Revolution, it's a candidate for execution. Okay, I'm just going to kind of make it so we can kind of see one statement at a time here. This one, for sure, is one that we have to have here. So this is saying, again, active sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2, that's her PT, dot add data field. active sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2. Do you see it? What's that? That's PT. Pivot fields value. Ah, yeah, so that's actually one of our fields. It's called the value. That's where all the numbers are that we're working with. And we are going to call that, we're going to, we're adding a data field. So we're making this a data field. And we're going to call it sum of value, and the type is going to be a sum. That looks great. Now this next part, let's see if we can figure out what this is talking about. Active sheet, pivot table 2, pivot tables, dot pivot fields state. Right, yeah, so we're saying, hey, we have a pivot field here, it's state, and we're gonna make it a row field. And we're doing two things. We're making a row field and we're putting it in position 1. Any thoughts on where that might go? If we didn't tell it what position to put it into? It's gonna go in position 1. It's gonna just add it to the bottom of the list. And so I don't think I need the width. I definitely need this pivot table part. So that gets me to PT. And since I'm not using the width, I'll just bring this up onto this line. I don't need to set the position. So that looks good. I'm gonna, before I get too far ahead of myself, I'm gonna go ahead and move my stop down here. And I'll run this. It should create a new sheet. And we should now have, what should we expect to see? Let's just think about what should we expect to see now? Based on what we see here in the code, yeah, I'll have my rows will have the states, and then I'll have the sum of the values there. That's that's what I think it should be. And that's what I see here. So here's sheet 4. It's got the states, it's got the sum of the values. And again, this doesn't mean anything because it's got crime data mixed in with the enrollment data. But we've built it that far. Okay, so far so good. We'll look at this next one, same thing. We don't have to tell position 2 because we're adding it. That's where it's gonna go. It's gonna go on the bottom of the list. So I'll simplify this by bringing this down to PT. Bringing the orientation up, deleting the rest of it. Same thing with the next one. PT, it's going to be the orientation there. Now I do want to kind of run that and make sure that works. My recollection is those are going to go in order. The other reasonable thing that it might do is it might actually insert them at the top of the list. I don't think it will. In that case, we just reverse the order here, but let's go ahead and just run this and see what we get. Yeah, state, and then the school, and then the campus. And let's just kind of go ahead and work through these next, let's see. This is, yeah, these next two are our columns. It's the same thing as we did with the rows. So we should be able to come in here and just say we're talking about pivot table, set the orientation. Pivot table, set the orientation. Now this is our report filter. Looks like it's kind of the same thing. Now, I'm kind of grouping these 3 together because these are all rows. I'll group these together because they're the column headers. This will be my report filter, so we'll do this one too. Let me oil that door. PT, pivot field, put the orientation there. This is the only one. So that's going to get our pivot table built, but not yet kind of configured the way that we want it configured. So far, so good? Active sheet, pivot tables, pivot fields. Okay, so here's where we're clearing the existing report. So do that one, PT. I may bring this up onto the same line. Clear all the filters. And then PT, current page, setting it to 2006. Now this next one, we selected A7, but that was so we could collapse the detail. I don't think we need to select A7 to do that. Go ahead. Oh, so the question is, how could we make it so that you could select the year that we want? Let's do that, but let's not do it now. We probably wouldn't use an input box. We'll probably find some other way to do it. You could, but. All right, let's go ahead and get these other ones. So we've got these three details here that happen. Those are going to be pretty easy to collapse. And so pivot field, I'm just going to go ahead and bring this down to set PT to that. Show detail is false. PT. Got a lot of PT equals. If we wanted to, we could come up here and say with PT, and we can do all this stuff. Instead of saying PT dot, we would just say dot in front of it. I don't like it. PT is so short that I'm happy just to put the PT in front of it. You see what I'm saying? Anytime I see lots of lines of code where I'm saying the same object dot something, the same object dot something, it's a candidate for using the with construct. But yeah, I think it's much more readable this way. You can see, that's the PT object we're dealing with. What do we got going on for state here? Oh, it's setting all of these to false. Yeah, this is where I filtered it down to Utah. Pivot fields. How did this do it before where it did them all? Clear all filters. I wonder if we have a clear all filters here. Pivot fields, clear all filters. That's so interesting that it recorded that way. I'm going to put a stop right here and go delete my prior stop. I'm just going to run it right here, and then I'm going to try to clear all the filters and see if it does it. Where's my other stop? Oh, here it is. All right, so let's run that. There's my stop. Okay, so far so good. So my question is, could I do the clear, where's clear all filters? Right here. My question is, can I apply this to the state? So while I'm in break mode, I'm just going to kind of come up here to the immediate window and give it a shot. I've never tried this before. Active sheet pivot table 2, pivot field state. So the pivot field is state. Clear all filters. No error. Didn't do much. So maybe that's the way we have to record it. That's ugly. Clear all filters. Surprising that it didn't give an error, but it didn't do it either. What does the filter say here? What's that? Oh. Pivot item dot visible. Yeah, we might have to do a little Googling and find out if there's a way to do this all in one fell swoop. It's not showing as readily apparent, so let's just go ahead and change this to PT to get to our current one, PT. And then that will, we'll just let that run. And the same thing here. I don't think I took the width off of this one. Oh, I didn't mean to. With, thank you. PT pivot table field state. Oh yeah, I just deleted too much when I changed it to PT. Then we'll do the same thing here, change that to PT. Oh. This didn't record everything because we never got Utah set to true, did we? Oh, it didn't set it to false. And I wonder why it does it. Isn't this the same thing? This can be the same block, don't you think? Oh, it's split where Utah is. How interesting. I'm going to go ahead and take that off and bring that just into one large width block. Wyoming's not there, Utah's not there, and what was our other one? Colorado, just check. Colorado's not there, so it's turning everything off. Yeah, I think this is a candidate for us to figure out a way that does this that's a little more robust, because we are not recording Hawaii or Idaho, the ones we're missing. Our next data might bring those in. But let's call this good for now. Take out my... We just run through and make them all visible. Okay, yeah, I see that. So let's run this first, make sure it works, and then we'll try the loop, which I like. So I'm going to run that. Yeah, looks like it's put us right then to where we want to be, right the way that we left it. So let's go ahead and see if we can do this as a loop. So really logically what we're saying is we want to turn them all off, and then we want to turn on 3 specific ones. That's better because this one turns off all the ones that are not in that set, but we're not sure that that's going to be the complete set in the future. Okay, so we've got a collection here called pivot items. So let's just make a loop for that. We'll use a for each loop. This is kind of made for a for each loop. So I'm going to call it PI for pivot item as an object. We could probably make it as a pivot item object. We'll just do it as object because we're not going to do anything interesting with it. For each PI in this pivot items collection. Next. And what do we want to do? We just want to say pi.visible equals false. Then I want to say with the state field, I want to turn on Utah. What's that? Oh, stand by. Let me get this working and I'll take your question. So Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. So yeah, I like this a lot better. Well, if it works, I'll like it a lot better. No error, that's a good sign. Oh, error, unable to set the visible property. So it should be showing them all here. Whoa, it kind of did it. It was unable to, oh, it couldn't do the one on Wyoming, why not? Why do you think the error happened? Why did it work on some but not Wyoming? Coincidental that Wyoming is one that we want to show. Did it know? You don't hide that one. You want to show that one. Is that what it's doing? What do you think it's doing? Yeah, it's saying you can't hide them all. You got to have at least one showing. It's not a great error here. Oh, unable. It just says unable to set the visibility part. It doesn't tell you why. But that's got to be the reason why. So, yeah, the question is, could we just do a regular for loop, and then we could start with like the second one and go on, or not quite go all the way to the end. That would definitely work. I sure like the for each loop here, but it's not letting us get to that last one. So pivot items, what's that? Yeah, we could kind of put in here and say, don't turn it off if it's Utah or Wyoming or Colorado. I'm not sure how to actually get to the name of it. Let's see if we can find out. There's a question here. Go ahead and ask it, or was it a suggestion? PI dot, let's just PI dot name. Oh, good. So we can actually access the name. So let's just do that in here. Let's just say if, I think I like it this way. In string, starting at 1, looking at something, looking for PI dot name. If that equals 0, if it didn't find it, then we want to set it to false. And then we just have to put in here the ones that we're interested in, which is Utah. Yeah, this will actually make the code even kind of cleaner. Wyoming. Oops. Colorado. You probably want to have spaces in there, but what we're saying is here, look at the current name. And if that name is not in this string, then set it to false. But when the name is Utah, it will be in that string. When it's Wyoming, it will be in this string. You think we should put the spaces in there? It won't hurt to have the spaces in, but. Do we have any states that are subsets of other states? Oh yeah, Virginia and West Virginia. So if this would be a problem, this approach would be a problem if we were, let's see, if we were trying to show West Virginia, because it would also show Virginia, because Virginia would be in there. And there are things that we could do with that. Well, no, because if it said West Virginia in here, then when we're looking for Virginia, it's going to find it. Oh, just put West. No, because it's actually the name that it's looking for is defined. It's going to be West Virginia. Oh no, yeah. So yeah, but you're still right. It wouldn't, because it wouldn't find West Virginia if it's just West. Holy cow! Wow, we made that a lot simpler. We could almost fit it on one of my screens. I get rid of those comments, bring these on to a little bit less white space, close my immediate window. Does it fit? No, but it's close. It's really close. Oh, I just want to make it fit. I usually don't do this, but you can declare multiple variables on the same line just by putting a comma. Don't have to repeat the word dim. Whoops. I'm ever so close. I'm not going to make it. Anyway, so this code, this was hideous when we started, and now it's not too bad. I mean, the code is pretty readable. So now the question is, how can we make them select the year? Now, what do you mean select the year? Do you mean have the user select the year? Well, I wouldn't do that, because the user can select the year right here. Right there, that's easy to do. But maybe I wanted to make this general enough so that I have some other process that chooses the right year. Maybe it finds the maximum year. We want to show whatever the maximum year is, that we could figure out what the maximum is, and then we could just use that here. Maybe we could just set up as a parameter report year, and then we would call this something else that passes in the report year. You could certainly could do it without too much work, but yeah, I wouldn't want it just for the user to pick it, because the whole point is they can pick it. Let's run this, make sure it does what we think it should do. Beautiful. Okay, oh, the other thing I want to do here is we've been saying to create a lot of pivot caches. So we've got a pivot cache collection. This workbook pivot caches should have a count. If I told you the truth, then if I asked for the count, how many should we have? I think we're only going to have one, because I think Excel is smart enough that when you say create a pivot cache and you already have an identical cache, it doesn't create it. It just returns the reference to the already existing one. So if that's true, it's going to give us 1. If it's false, it'll give us 5 or 6. I've done it a bunch of times. I think it's going to be 1. Ah! 8. So we've created pivot caches that we really don't want. So we only have 2 minutes left. So we need to add some logic in here that says, let's check and see if this pivot cache already exists. And if so, don't create it. Pivot caches, I don't even know what properties we have to work with. Pivot caches 1.0. I'm hoping that there's something here that could let us know like what the address is. Well, yeah, we could clear it, but I could see that we have here in the workbook that we might want 3 or 4. This could be one of 3 or 4 different pivot caches. So workbook connection, source data. I don't know what that is. So I don't think that's it though. Oh, really? Oh, interesting. You're working on the online version? No, you're not working on the online version. Oh, well, you said on mine. Parent, query type, record count. Oh, it's making interesting. The comment was, if you delete the sheet, it'll take a cache with it. That's really interesting to me because the cache doesn't belong to a worksheet, it belongs to the workbook. But presumably if you're deleting the table, you're deleting the pivot table, that's the pivot cache. So that won't really help us because you have to delete them all. That's the whole point. We want to have, it would be nice to be able to say, you know what, we want to make 2 or 3 pivot tables off the same cache. So that would take a little work to figure out. I don't see, connection. I don't really see anything straight away that lets me know that would be easy to check to see, is this one already existing? But anyway, I will leave that as an exercise for the interested student. One last question, then we'll call it good. So yeah, so the question is, would it so if the database changed, would the pivot cache update automatically? And the answer is no. You've got to tell the pivot cache to refresh. Now we can set it to automatically refresh when the workbook opens. So if we open the workbook, the database changed, automatically refresh, but it does not consume any information about that. It has to go out and check it. All right, thanks for coming. Class dismissed.
Let me create a few more and check again.